You're listening to the Final Say Radio Show, a Rappaport Media production, with your host Brett Rappaport and co-host John Rappaport.
We have Charles Hoskinson joining us from the Washington Examiner. Charles, it's always great to have you, and I was opening up the discussion on the interesting comments from the president with regards to Al-Qaeda being decimated and we got Osama bin Laden. And I'm informing the audience that, you know, when we started this, I'll call it a fiasco in 2001, we knew that they operated in one location, being harbored by the Taliban. And, of course, that's in Afghanistan. And now we can confirm at least 12 nations that Al-Qaeda is located in. And, of course, we are now dealing with the threat of an offspring, if you will, or an even more extreme form of Al-Qaeda in what we would refer to as ISIS or IS, or if you're the president, ISIL.
Thanks for having me.
Well, it's always a pleasure to speak with you, Chuck. And, you know, it's very interesting. I find this, and by the way, a side note, I'm going to go on a little side tangent right here. Happy birthday, the 227th birthday of our Constitution. And it's significant to me, and I wish more Americans were aware of that very fact. And of course, I wish more Americans, specifically those 535 members plus the one in the White House, were paying attention to these things a little more. So I just wanted to throw that out there for you.
Yes, and also today is another very important anniversary. People should remember this, given all the talk about American deaths in Iraq and Afghanistan. But today is the 152nd anniversary of the bloodiest day in American military history, the Battle of Antietam. And even with all the wars we've had since, we've never matched that one-day total of casualties that we had on that day.
That's an excellent point. And actually, I should have remembered that because several good friends of mine who write about the Civil War have discussed all these battles. And yes, I should have remembered that. So thank you very much, Charles. If we can, now that we've taught, you know, probably more history to our audience than our educational system has this year. And I laugh, but, you know, my kids bring home their stuff from school, and I ask them every day, so what did you do in school? And I said, well, in history, we set up our notebooks. And I'm thinking to myself, you spent an entire class period setting up your notebook? What did they actually teach you? And of course, they couldn't answer that question. But it goes to speak of how much Americans aren't aware of, or how much we forget because they're not common in our daily discussions. But anyway, that aside, I know we're getting completely off tangent here. But back to ISIS. The president has, of course, made speeches, and they're working on this. We know that NATO has met, and, of course, they're meeting regarding a lot of things. But there were a lot of discussions with Arab states and European members as to what to do with ISIS. Could you report on some of the roadblocks or obstacles that are coming in, that we're coming into as we're trying to form a coalition to deal with ISIS?
Well, right now there's not really any new bad news in the sense that the president went down to MacDill Air Force Base to talk to the folks at Central Command today, and he announced what Secretary Hagel said yesterday, is there are 40 countries that have made specific commitments to the coalition. For example, Australia, Canada, Germany are all on board to help train Iraqi troops. France and the UK are participating in air missions with the United States. Saudi Arabia has agreed to host the training of Syrian rebels, and we find out from Secretary Hagel yesterday that they're also going to help pay for it, which is something that we were wondering about because the president asked for $500 million to pay for this, and the resolution that they're debating in the House right now does not fund any money.
Well, that's a very interesting topic that you just added in there. In fact, I was not related to ISIS, of course, but I was involved in a Twitter conversation, if you will, about the continuing resolutions, and, you know, the comment being that I could not remember another administration or period of time where we didn't operate under budgets as constitutionally required, and that the quick fix was, you know, continuing resolution after continuing resolution, and I'm trying to figure out how do you exactly keep track of what you're spending on anything when you operate under this type of system, which isn't really a system in my mind. But that's a very good point. We've seen significant cuts to the military. We've already seen and discussed this numerous times about the impact on all of our armed forces, our ability to respond to multiple threats around the world simultaneously. And of course, as you see a new threat, or a threat that's become a hot topic, at least in ISIS, as we're figuring out, well, how are we going to pay for this? Thank you for the information, by the way, that the Saudi Arabians are willing to pay for some of the training of the rebels, and that, to me, that is significant, and I welcome it. But coming up with $500 million to deal with this issue, to me, of course, we want to deal with this issue, but where exactly is that money going to go to? Has there been an accounting for what they intend to do with it from the administration, or is this just give us the money, we'll figure it out afterward?
Well, what's interesting about this Syria resolution is that people complain about the lack of bipartisanship in Washington, and we've got bipartisanship on both sides in this case. The president asked for quick action on this, and the House Republicans joined in with the Senate Democrats and the House Democratic leadership, and they're giving it to them. But now you've got both Democrats, even though it's expected to pass, you've got both Democrats and Republicans who are a little upset about this thing being fast-tracked and want to do a little more deliberate consideration of it. So it may be a close vote.
Well, that's interesting. So you mean to tell me that Harry Reid actually came out of hiding to work on this?
Yes, and I think it's also important to note that the House Republicans, the House Republican leadership, the president said, "I need this now," and they worked out a way to fast track it to make sure that he gets it.
Yeah, well, I would think from the conversations that I've had with many members, at least on the House Republican side, and a few senators, they all completely understand the threat of radical Islam, the serious threat of these terrorist organizations, not just to the United States interests abroad or to our allies, but here at home as well. And I feel pretty comfortable that they're willing to fund what is necessary. I think any concerns they may have, and of course I can't really speak for the Democratic Party, would be exactly how the use of funds are going to be. As I said, what will the use of funds be? Who's going to handle the funding? Is this the first of many asks, or is there just a general amount? Can we say, let's cap this off at $3 billion, and here's the first $500 billion? So I'm sure there's things that should be discussed, but I wouldn't want the operation, of course, as soon as we have a clear and coherent strategy, held up for this type of a thing.
Well, right now, the authority to train the Syrian rebels doesn't come with any funding. If this resolution passes, and it's expected to pass, it will not have any funding. On the broader issue of defense spending and defense budget cuts, one of the biggest problems is, as you mentioned, government by continuing resolution, government without a budget. The Pentagon has been complaining for years that government by continuing resolution is making it almost impossible for them to plan long-term what they need to face the threats that America is facing today.
Well, that's an excellent point, and I believe we've actually discussed this particular issue, that there are certainly things that the Pentagon can cut, but I think we could all agree that we need to sufficiently fund important weapon systems within the military, and of course have enough standing and trained men in our professional army to handle the threats that we face. And I'm not sure that we have that right now.
With funding by continuing resolution is that you can't start new programs. I mean, if you have an aircraft carrier that's in the yards being built, you can keep building it, but you can't start another one if you feel like you need a new aircraft carrier.
Yeah, excellent point. And, if we could step back for just a second, forget about the terrorist threat, forget about ISIS, forget about, members of our government. But if you look at, from a strategic standpoint, you have a significant rise in the capabilities and power, really, of the Chinese military. And you also have a resurgence of spending, not even just recently, but for a while now, by Putin and the Russians on rebuilding a lot of their capabilities. Then, of course, you have Iran and you have other countries we need to be concerned about. But I think as a whole, who is looking at how much spend and what types of systems we actually need to combat and face all those threats simultaneously if we had to? Because I feel like that's what our strategy should be. Not just can we deal with China, can we deal with Russia? We have to, have our eyes open that someday we may have to face everyone together. And can we do that?
Yes, because there are people both in the Pentagon and in Congress who are looking at this. But what's happened is that all these threats have really grown in the past year. We were looking, Russia went after Crimea earlier this year. ISIS came into focus as a threat earlier this year. We just learned today that the Chinese are spying on contractors from U.S. Transportation Command, trying to see if they can track U.S. military movements. All these things are new threats. And what's happening is people are saying, hey, maybe it's time to take a new look at these budget cuts that we put on the military and the budget cuts that we're going to put on the military in the future and turn this ship around.
Yeah, well, it's a very good question. You just reminded me, and we discuss this all the time about the Chinese interference, not just in our military and government, but, just to do business in China. They have stolen a lot of intellectual property. They've actually made businesses or corporations hand over a lot of things that they never would have, but that's just the price of doing business there. But it's a very good question. Is it time for the United States to have an open and honest debate about what to do with Chinese interference and spying on not just our corporations, but on our military and on our government? Because we know they're doing all three.
Oh, it's definitely time, and this is something that the Pentagon has been worried for years. I mean, Leon Panetta, who was the former Secretary of Defense, said that one of the things, the cyber Pearl Harbor, was something that he worried about all the time. And Admiral Mike Mullen, who was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff about the same time, he said this is cybersecurity was something that kept him up nights. So the Pentagon has been worried about it for quite some time.
Yeah, I can see that. By the way, Leon Panetta, I think, has held just about every post except for president or vice president. But so, to see certainly, I might not agree with everything he says, but he's certainly somebody who we should be listening to. And by the way, it's not just China. I think, Russian hackers have been hacking, our banking systems and our companies and probably our military installations as well. So it's certainly a threat from multiple sides. And I think it's important for us to understand that in the 21st century, that with technology increasing and changing at the speed of how do we even measure it anymore? It's so fast. But we have to keep up with the new threats, and we have to have the forces in place to monitor and deal with them.
That's correct. And this is something that NATO had to face at the recent summit. General Breedlove, Philip Breedlove, the U.S. Air Force Supreme Allied Commander of NATO forces in Europe, he mentioned that cyber attacks are part of the new hybrid method of war that Russia has used against Ukraine. And I'd like to point out they've also used this against Estonia, which is a NATO member. So it could be, in a way, these kinds of attacks could be a precursor to a larger assault on either the United States or an allied country.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I believe Poroshenko, I know it's coming up very soon, but he's going to be addressing the joint session of Congress and meeting with the president here. And so that's certainly interesting to follow with regards to Ukraine. I know you have somewhat of a ceasefire. There's certainly been reports of firing in Donetsk and Mariupol and other places, but there's some interesting, whether it be the amnesty that was offered to the rebels or things of that nature going on there. And I suppose part of me actually believes that the Russians are trying to be as cooperative. I know the Russians have clearly sent troops into Ukraine. I understand they took the Crimea. I understand all the things that they're doing, but I don't necessarily believe that they want to escalate this more than they have. And I feel that economically they're already feeling the bite, if you will, and they understand that it's going to really crush their economy going forward. So I think they, reasonably speaking, they have to try their best to cooperate, some sort of repairing of what's happened in Ukraine at the very least, if you will. And so while I do think it's extremely important for us and NATO to be addressing these issues and actually fortifying their strength in Europe in the event that Russia would come into any one of these nations that we're obligated to defend, I think that at the moment the possibility of war or the increasing possibilities of war with Russia, I think have kind of stabilized from how I really felt about it, say, even just a week ago or 2 weeks ago.
Well, the interesting thing about the ceasefire is that it's very tenuous. And Breedlove held a press conference at the Pentagon yesterday, and he's said a couple of times that he's not really an optimist about what's going on in Ukraine right now, because it's obvious that the Russians are using the ceasefire to resupply the separatists and continue to press Ukraine as they can. And it looks like the Russians are also, there's serious concerns that the Russians are also trying to pressure the Baltic states, all of which, by the way, are NATO members. And, NATO was taken by surprise by a lot of the methods the Russians used to have their will in Ukraine without firing a shot, especially in Crimea. And they're very concerned that these methods might be tried against the Baltic states, where by the time it gets to the point where NATO has an obligation to intervene, the Russians have already tipped the balance in their favor.
Well, that's a good point, and that's why they're already. I forget the exact number. What do we send? Like 250 paratroopers to each of 4 nations in Eastern Europe. I think it was about 1,000 total troops. But I think it would be important for either the United States and NATO or both to put whatever would be considered a significant showing of force, whether it be a few thousand troops in each nation and some amount of assets, I guess, to at least demonstrate that we're already here, and you should understand that entering any of these nations or of course interfering any further would set this off. Unlike right. In Ukraine, where we were very actively somehow in the background involved with the discussions of the government of Kiev, but we're in no way ready to respond to what we should have realized Russia was going to do. And I feel like that was a complete misstep. I like for NATO or anyone else to have been surprised that Russia was going to intervene after the way things went down in the government of Kiev. I think you and I watching this weren't surprised at all what happened.
No, but the big surprise was the methods the Russians used. The introduction yes. of what they call little green men, people with no insignia who turned out to be Russian soldiers, who went in and they basically seized control of all the key strategic parts of Crimea without firing a shot.
Yeah, which was that was a tough blow, by the way, and it certainly sent a message to us. As we're having this conversation, I realized that I can't recall really reading anything over the last few weeks about the MH17, the flight that was shot down over Ukraine, almost as though people have had their funerals and buried whatever they had to bury, whatever remains were sent back to them. But it's almost like everyone's afraid to even bring up or broach that topic.
Well, as far as I understand, I haven't really kept up with it as well as I should either. But as far as I understand, the investigation has pretty much pointed to the idea that the plane was brought down by a surface-to-air missile supplied to the separatists by the Russians. And I'm not sure where the governments involved, like the Dutch government or the Malaysian government, is able to go from that point. The biggest nightmare scenario for NATO military planners is the idea that the Russians will continue to be assertive to the point where, say, they threaten the Baltics and put the United States in a position where the U.S. government has to decide, are you going to go to war with Russia to save Latvia? Are you going to go to war with Russia to save Estonia? Or even, are you going to go to war with Russia to save Poland? People have even brought up the possibility that Russia would use a nuclear weapon against Poland and say to the United States, well, we didn't attack you. Why should you retaliate?
Well, look, those are all excellent questions. My personal feeling is when you have treaties and we haven't done a great job of this, but when you give your word that you are going to defend a nation, whether it be Japan or the Philippines or any of these other nations, and they come across problems, then there has to be some sort of step taken. It doesn't mean that you have to go to war, and it doesn't mean that you have to fire shots. There are other things that you could do, both politically or diplomatically. So I'm not saying that we have to just jump in a war with Russia with every action that they take. But I also think that the Russians understand strength, and they understand, valued moves, if you will. I just don't think that this administration has made any moves which the Russians feel threatened by outside of possibly the sanctions. But they haven't even taken that far enough. If you really wanted to send a message to Russia, you would just make a public statement that says, we're considering the removal of Russia from the WTO or from the complete international banking system. And I think, boy, that would send shockwaves through the Russian markets, wouldn't it?
It probably would hurt worse than the current sanctions have hurt. Up to this point, there's not been a lot of sign. Even if the sanctions have hurt the Russians, there isn't much in the way of signs that it has changed their behavior in dealing with what they perceive to be their interests in Ukraine. So,
well, it hasn't. It hasn't.
That's part of the problem. It seems like you mentioned weakness, the perception of weakness. It seems like the Russians have that perception, and they appear to be willing to press their advantage as much as they can, as long as they can get away with it.
Well, from what I'm told, I think part of the problem that Putin has is he has a wing within his own country that's looking to be more extreme than even he has been. And, he can't necessarily just pull back from his stance either. I think you have a lot of people in tough situations, and it's even tougher when you have a president who's so wishy-washy or incoherent with his strategy. And, he loves to give a speech but hardly ever backs it up. And I think it only makes matters worse. But, of course, time will tell where we end up in this particular situation, or any of these situations, really.
People in the world know that the United States is cutting its defense budget. They know that the United States is going through tough budget times and will probably continue to cut its defense budget, shrink its military. A lot of analysts have pointed out that every time something happens in the Middle East, it seems that China and Russia become more assertive. And they know that the United States is becoming less capable in reacting to multiple crises at once. So that may be the pattern for the future, that the United States is going to have to figure out a way to multitask on a shrinking military.
Well, I actually think the answer is easier than some of the things that get offered up. And I feel simply, you have a nuclear China, you have a nuclear North Korea, and if you simply were to put some sort of nuclear type assets in and around South Korea or Japan, and also in Europe, if you were to put back the missile defense and other things that we've discussed or had out there over time, I think you show that you mean business, and perhaps just those steps alone would get the other parties back to the table to reasonably discuss some of these things that we've seen happening, whether it be the nonstop incursions into the neighbors by China in the South China Sea, or by Russia, obviously, in the Ukraine, and interference in other states.
Well, when you talk about the shrinking defense budget, the nuclear deterrence is one of those parts that's shrinking. And it's also coming up to the point where it's going to be badly in need of modernization in the near future. That's going to cost a lot of money. There are a lot of discussions about whether to build a new ICBM. What kind of new nuclear missile sub and how many the United States will build. And whether the United States needs a new manned bomber, and if so, how much will we be able to spend on that? One of those things, we built the B-1 as a new strategic bomber, and they made hundreds of those. They built the B-2 as a new strategic bomber, and the U.S. could only afford 20 of those because they cost about $2 billion a piece. If the next strategic bomber is more expensive, it might get to the point where the United States could only afford 10. And at that point, how much value does 10 aircraft have?
Well, it could be a lot of value unless they could be shot down easily. In that case, I know that the planes in our systems are much different today than they were during World War II, but when you look at the amount of planes and tanks that were just used and destroyed in that war, obviously 10 or 20 of anything isn't going to get you very far.
That's true. Of course, the United States still has the B-52, and there actually are pilots who are flying the same planes their grandfathers flew. That's how old they are. I think that the youngest B-52 is coming on 50 years old.
It's amazing. They should really analyze some of the workmanship or technology that they used in those planes when they build some of the modern things, and I'm sure they do, but for something to hold out under those types of circumstances for so long, speaks of some of our positive feats, if you will, from that era. Anyway, Charles Hoskinson, it's been great speaking with you as always, and of course you can find all the work of Charles at the WashingtonExaminer.com, and I'm sorry, I always forget your Twitter handle.
It's C.E. Hoskinson.
C.E. Hoskinson, okay. I'll remember next time. Anyway, great as always, and we look forward to speaking to you again soon. Thank you.
Thanks for having me. Have a good afternoon.
Take care. You too. Bye.
Bye-bye.